Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, my name is Kimbyrleigha. Nice to finally meet you. Today's case is quite a mysterious one. It's one of those cases that leaves you with so many questions, even after you know what happened. I might be doing a couple shorter cases here and there. These are ones I wanted to share and I thought were important to bring awareness to while working on a couple of deep dives that will take me longer to research. A lot of cases I want to do just don't have enough information for me to go into a long form video, but I was actually able to find quite a lot of information for this particular case, which I thought was going to be shorter, but there were just so many twists and turns. But before I get into today's video, please just give a moment to one of our loyal sponsors, PDS Debt. I think I've been working with PDS Debt for close to a year now. That seems incredibly crazy. I can't believe it's been that long, but every time I feature them on my channel, I continue to get great feedback from all of you, and I keep hearing that you wished you would have looked into doing something about your debt sooner. I know how stressful finances can be. The topic is easy to ignore, but if you are ignoring your actual debt, it's likely that you're missing out on thousands you could be saving in interest and monthly payments with PDS Debt. PDS Debt has customized zero interest options for anyone that's struggling with credit cards, personal loans, medical bills, and collections accounts. Plus, PDS Debt is giving all of you a free debt saving breakdown for completing a 30-second online debt assessment at pdsdebt.com/Kim. You will receive a full breakdown of all the interest that you shouldn't be paying every month and multiple options on how they can help you get rid of it. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, this program is for you. PDS Debt rolls all of your payments into one low, zero interest monthly payment. Everyone with over $10,000 in debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. Fair credit and bad credit are accepted. Save thousands in interest and fees and pay off your debt in a fraction of the time. PDS Debt is offering a free debt analysis to all of you just for completing the quick and easy debt assessment at pdsdebt.com/Kim. That's pdsdebt.com/Kim. So take back your financial freedom today by visiting pdsdebt.com/Kim. Thanks so much to PDS Debt for continuing to support my channel and make these videos possible. Now, let's get into the case for today. I would like to introduce you to Latrese Curtis. Her friends and loved ones called her Trese. She was born on May 28, 1986, to parents Sherman Jones and Cynthia Wheeler of Raleigh, North Carolina. Latrese had three brothers, Justin, Marlon, and Jason, and one sister, Shanisha. And Latrese was a daddy's girl. She grew up with her three older brothers, and she definitely got away with a lot more than they did growing up. They used to refer to her as Daddy's little boy in a dress because Sherman did everything with his little baby girl, Latrese. Things that you would traditionally do with a son, but it didn't matter because she loved spending time with her daddy. They would go fishing together, hunting, and most of all, Sherman taught little Latrese everything he knew about his favorite sport, which was basketball. And they loved spending quality time together. Basketball equaled quality time, and Sherman was dedicated to teaching Latrese how to dribble, how to shoot, and even do layups. And when they weren't passing the ball on the court or at the park, they were attached at the hip, doing everything and nothing at all. Sherman would joke around about her being like his little shadow, because wherever he went, she seemed to follow right behind him, even to the point where he would end up stepping on her because she was right under his feet. He loved it, and he tried to enjoy it because he knew once his little girl got into her teens, it would most likely be a different story. And he was right. Junior high rolled around, and Latrese was growing up. She was becoming her own person. She had her own hobbies and her own social life. Now, instead of being right by Sherman's side, he had to go looking for her because she was always into something. She had a very active social life. Latrese was beautiful. She was one of the most popular girls at her high school, and she was funny and outgoing, and everyone loved her. She knew how to make you laugh and put a smile on your face. And she always had guys talking to her, asking her out on dates, but she was interested in school and staying out of trouble more than boys. Because her daddy, Sherman, was a juvenile corrections officer. So he made sure his kids were staying out of trouble. As she was coming into her own, she enjoyed more girly things. Getting her nails done and her hair done, And as Sherman had imagined, that meant Latrese was spending less time with him playing basketball and less time hanging out with him because she didn't want to get her hair and her nails messed up. So that was the end of those type of bonding moments, but they still remained very close. Their relationship evolved, as many parent-child relationships do. And in this case, with Latrese's parents, trying to find other ways to be a part of her life and supportive of her endeavors. One of which was excelling academically. Latrese always had an interest in doing well in school. Her dream was to get married and have a family of her own one day. She made plans to go to college and fulfill that dream. After she graduated from high school, she attended Bennett College from 2004 to 2005. When her daddy dropped her off that first day, he cried. And she cried because they knew this was going to be the first time that they would be apart. But he knew how much she wanted this. So it was hard to say goodbye, but he knew he had to let her go. And Latrese did really well at Bennett. She then transferred to Wake Technical Community College in Greensboro, North Carolina. As Latrese was growing up, she was known as a cute, petite, bubbly young lady with a little unique, kind of high-pitched voice that friends could recognize right away without even seeing her face. She was dedicated to her studies. She would stay up late studying, working on an exam or a college project, and during the first semester of her freshman year, she ends up meeting someone special. Even though boys were not a priority, this one mattered. His name was Darren Lee Curtis. He was also from Raleigh, and he was a former National Guard soldier. He was also in college, but he was attending the prestigious North Carolina Central University about 30 minutes away in Durham. He was an accounting student, and they just hit it off. They had so much in common, and everyone could tell they were in love. And sometimes it's hard to get into a serious relationship in college, but it worked for these two because they were both serious about their studies, and they allowed each other that time to sit there with their nose in a book, and they understood their priorities. They were also both working part-time in Raleigh. Latrese worked in human resources at the Sears department store in Triangle Town Center Mall, and Darren was a part-time accountant with a firm which was in Raleigh as well. So he had a 30-minute commute from school to work every day. They both valued hard work and being loyal to the company they were working for. They had also chosen to go the business route in college because they envisioned it would enable them both to get a high-paying job. And neither one wanted to worry about the burden of not having the things they needed or they wanted in life, especially because they wanted to be able to support a family one day without worrying too much about where the money was coming from. And they didn't want that to stand in the way of their goals. Though she was focused on her future goals of making a good living, Latrese was not materialistic. She was humble and down to earth. She was the type of friend that you can count on to give you really good advice when you needed it. Many of her friends would come to her when they were having problems, and she would give them honest and straightforward answers that just made sense. And people who knew Darren said that he was kind and he was down to earth, and they seemed to make a perfect couple. After they'd been dating for a while, Latrese finally introduced him to her family. Her father was very protective, so even though they had already been dating for a bit, she waited to introduce Darren to her family because she didn't know how her father was going to take it or what he was going to think. One thing they can tell right away was how much Latrese liked Darren, so of course, they were going to give him a shot. He was quiet, reserved, ambitious, studious. He seemed like a good kid. All they hoped was that he was good for their daughter. Well, just 1 year into their relationship, Darren and Latrese knew that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. But first, they wanted to spend their days and nights together instead of living apart. So they moved in together to a luxury apartment complex in Raleigh called Aberley Grove. It was nice. It had a little barbecue area with a pool, cute little dog park, and even a park for children. And that would be great when the time came for them to start a family. And this would be a perfect starter home for them. The rooms, they were nice and spacious, and they had a really cozy feel to them, even though it was an apartment. There was more exciting news. Latrese was accepted to North Carolina Central University, and now both of them would be making the 30-minute commute from Raleigh, but it was such a great school, so it was worth it. Latrese was majoring in business management and administration. The couple couldn't wait. They were determined to share the same last name, ASAP. So on April 27, 2007, 1 month before Latrese's 21st birthday, they got married at the courthouse in Wake County. This wasn't exactly the type of wedding that her family had in mind for her. They actually didn't even know the couple was planning a wedding. And it turns out no one did. Not even Latrese's closest friends. Her work friends, for instance, like her colleague Kimberly Parker Dasher, who had been working with her for the last couple of years at this point, they had become really good friends. As a matter of fact, Latrese surprised everyone by walking into work one day with a smile from ear to ear, but she was also wearing something else, a wedding ring. And yes, everyone noticed because Latrese was definitely making it obvious. You know how women can be? That's how she was. She was ecstatic. She was so happy. And they said, "Oh my God, is that a ring on your finger?" And she's like, "Yes, I got married." And they were like, "What?" Because everyone was shocked. They did not see that coming. Latrese just seemed very responsible, and not that it was irresponsible to get married out of the blue. They just weren't expecting it. Well, there was one person that wasn't as excited about the matrimony, and that was Sherman, Latrese's dad. He was pretty upset that Darren hadn't even asked him for his daughter's hand in marriage or even gotten to know the family. Sherman had no clue that this man was going to make Latrese his bride, and he felt disrespected. He was mad at Latrese as well, and he let it show. It was a type of emotion where he knew she was an adult, but he would make it known that he wasn't thrilled about her choices. He had a hard time even talking to his daughter. He just held resentment. So even when she would call to check in and see how everyone was doing, he would give her the cold shoulder. He would give her a hard time. He would say something like, "What's wrong with you, girl? What's the rush?" Something like that. He knew that Latrese had purposely kept their intentions from him because she knew how he might react, as protective as he was. But at the end of the day, he knew it was Latrese's choice, and she chose Darren. By the early part of January 2008, Latrese was going into her senior year at NCCU. She was still working part-time at Sears in Raleigh, and she'd been married to Darren for about 9 months. However, she began taking her business classes at night instead of during the day. She wanted to use the daytime to work because the couple was coming up on their last years at the university, and she had even bigger plans ahead. She wanted to start a family. No surprise, we already know that's one of her goals, and she shared this goal with her friends before the holidays. She confided in one friend in particular, Anisha Baldwin. Anisha had worked with her for at least 3 years at Sears, and Latrese actually said she wanted to try for a baby right after Christmas, but that Darren wasn't ready. Darren was 26, and Latrese was 21. So was Latrese ready? And it could have been that there was some added pressure, considering that one of her closest friends was pregnant and due right after the holidays. Latrese had time, and right now she was focused on school and work. And speaking of which, after a long day of work and classes, she would usually arrive home around 8 o'clock in the evening at night. After class got out, she would make that 30-minute commute, and Darren would usually get home like 15 to 30 minutes after her. So their schedules worked out perfectly, and they had stuck to this routine for some time now. Nothing was different on the evening of January 29th. Latrese had class, and Darren was at work. What wasn't ordinary was the next morning, January 30th, 2008. It wasn't ordinary at all, especially not for David Jones, who was on his morning commute on his way to a meeting. It was approximately 7:30 a.m. on a cold winter morning in Raleigh. David is driving down Interstate 540, and as traffic is slowing down, David passes time by looking out the window. He looks to the right, and something catches his eye. So he does a double take. He's like, "What is that?" The side of the road this time of year wasn't green and full of life. It was brown from the snow melting. It was dry, golden brown brush lining both sides of the road. He saw something lying up an embankment, and it didn't blend in to the foliage. It stood out. David can't leave. He pulls off the shoulder a little bit so that he can take a closer look without his car moving along the road. And he thinks that he knows what he's looking at, so he calls 911. He said he was going westbound on I-540 just past the Buffalo Road exit, and he thinks he sees a body on the side of the road. Now, to picture what David was looking at, I want to describe what this highway is like and what the terrain looks like on both sides. This will help you envision what David was seeing. By this time, it was light outside. He was going westbound just past that Buffalo exit. The ground next to the highway is a golden brown color. It's short and dry, dead grass. There wasn't tall green grass or bushes. It was less dense, where anything on the ground would stand out. What David saw was something lying on the embankment, like I said, so it was a little of an incline up toward more of a wooded area. And after that call, he knew. He was 100% certain that he knew what he was looking at. There was no mistaking it for anything else. He won't ever forget that moment, and I don't think you will either when you find out exactly what he was looking at. The 911 dispatcher sent officers to the location, and sure enough, it didn't take more than a few glances for officers to know that they were dealing with a deceased human being. As they approached, they could ascertain that it was a black female in her 20s. She was on her back with both arms spread out above her head and her legs spread very far apart, probably as far as they could go. She was wearing blue jeans, a white long-sleeve top covered in blood. There was no mistaking what David saw. With the way the body was positioned, it would have almost been facing the road on a slant instead of being flat. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how shocking it would be? I was able to find pictures of this crime scene, and I'm doing my very best to describe this because it has stuck with me. Can you imagine you're driving by and when you look over, instead of something being completely flat on the ground, you're seeing a person with their arms outstretched and they're on an incline. So instead of being back, they're up a little bit. So it's almost as though they're just facing the road like that. And the stark contrast of her dark skin and the white shirt, the bright white shirt, and the blood on the blue jeans and the white shirt, it was haunting. And initially, the first responders that got there, they thought this was probably a pedestrian that was struck by a vehicle, because it's common. When people are walking on the side of the road, a driver's eyes can catch a glimpse of them and be drawn, like the steering wheel can swerve and be drawn in that direction. It's an auto response. It's very dangerous to be on the shoulder of a busy highway, and it's absolutely terrible when this happens. But when they get closer, they realize that is not what happened here. This is not an accident at all. Someone did this to this poor girl. And officers get to work quickly to secure the scene. They don't want a passerby glancing over and seeing this horrific scene in front of them. They put up a tent around the body. They had a blue tarp over her. And then they put out something you can't miss at a crime scene, the yellow tape around the perimeter of the scene. Homicide detectives are called out along with Jennifer Raymer, who was the assistant district attorney of Wake County at the time. And as Jennifer walked up, she could tell this was brutal. It was as though all the blood had been drained because she was so pale, powdery blue in color. It was clear that a stabbing had occurred, and I shouldn't even refer to it as a stabbing because this was repeated impacts again and again, open wounds, large ones, specifically on the face, the neck, the chest. Jennifer knew this was more than someone that just wanted this woman to die. It was as though they were sending a message, and it was a personal one. So the first thing they want to do is identify who the body belongs to. But she doesn't have anything on her, and there's no vehicle in sight. So who was their Jane Doe on the side of I-540? Investigators don't have much to go on. This is a very busy section of highway. Cars are rushing by, hundreds of cars every hour. They don't know how long that she's been lying there, but they estimate from the condition of her body that it has been hours at this point. They're thinking, can we even find any eyewitnesses that would have seen anything as they're passing by at a high rate of speed, in addition to peering out through a blanket of darkness at night, there's a slim chance. So they rely on clues that may be nearby at the scene. Some investigators begin walking on foot down the highway in both directions, while others get into their vehicles to canvass the entire area. They do end up locating Latrese's phone. It was found several hundred feet from her body, turned off and exposed to rain and other environmental elements. But not even half a mile from where the woman's body was found, investigators see two cars parked on the side of the road, a white Honda Civic and a white Nissan Sentra. And there's a man standing by the Nissan, peering inside with the door wide open. What's going on here, and are these cars connected to their Jane Doe? Wait until you find out who this man is. It was a shock to detectives, that's for sure, because they're questioning him right away, asking, "Better identify yourself." And he explains that he's the husband of Latrese Curtis. And guess what? He reported her missing just about an hour earlier. He says he just found her car, the white Nissan, on the side of the road, so he stopped to see what was going on. It's plain to see the Nissan has been involved in a crime, a bloody one. It doesn't even take a search of it to see evidence that there has been a struggle, and it's apparent just by looking at the driver's seat, there's blood all over it. And Darren is standing right next to it. So clearly, investigators need to get Darren away from the vehicle and run the license plate number to match the car to its registered owner. And sure enough, the search comes back to Latrese Curtis. They pull up the ID and they see her picture, and they were able to do a preliminary match to the woman's body they found. And that's really sad. Now they have a name to match to their victim, and it's time to get Latrese transported to the coroner's office so that they can do a full autopsy and a 100% DNA confirmation of her identity. And you probably already made this connection, considering we are here today, and we wouldn't be if something bad hadn't happened to poor Latrese. But I have to backtrack so that you can get all the facts as they're playing out that fateful morning. Investigators bring Darren to the station, and they're asking him, "How did you end up at Latrese's car just minutes before detectives arrived and less than an hour after you reported her missing?" So he begins his version of the story. Darren explains he gets a call from Latrese around 10 p.m. the night before. It's a normal call. Nothing seemed like it was out of the ordinary. She said that she was running late from class. She'd been in the library studying and whatnot, and now she's on her way home, but she may stop and get a bite to eat first. She tells him to expect her home around 11:30 p.m. The thing is, Latrese never makes it home. And you'd think that her husband would think it's just a little bit odd, right? Because investigators are kind of puzzled when they ask him about that. Darren said he was so tired that he just fell asleep. I mean, I personally couldn't sleep if my loved one wasn't home, but that's me, and I get it. Everybody's different. And this was an ordinary night, according to Darren. Nothing to think twice about. However, this was not an ordinary night. Not at all. They want to know, when did you realize your wife hadn't come home the night before? And Darren explained he woke up at his usual time, around 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And they're like, "Wait a minute. You went to sleep. You never woke up once. You never checked if your wife came home." And he's like, "I was asleep. But when I woke up, yes, I realized Latrese is not in bed with me." So he says that he calls her to make sure that everything's okay. And it goes straight to her voicemail. So he leaves a message telling her, "Hey, I'm just calling to make sure you're all right, and just give me a call back whenever you can." Darren assumes that Latrese may have gone to her parents' house and slept over there. She may still be asleep. So he tells investigators he proceeded to get ready for work, showering, eating, his whole morning routine. Then he leaves their apartment to head to work around 7:30 in the morning. But here's where things get weird. Darren says he takes I-540 to work every single morning. And as he's driving, he glances over and he thinks he spots a car on the side of the road that looks like the one his wife drives, the white Nissan. But he's on the highway. He's driving by. It's just a split-second glance. However, A little further down, the traffic starts to get into a standstill. Now he's passing slowly and he spots yellow crime scene tape, and it was off to the side of the road. And of course that catches his eye. That's not something he's used to seeing on his morning commute. Even worse, as his eyes adjust, he sees the blue tarp, and that's when he says he gets a knot in his stomach. And according to him, he decides to turn off the highway and go back home to check on his wife. It was the fact that she didn't make it home coupled with the sight of the tarp. It just hit him. He couldn't help but think, what if something happened to my wife? Where is she? So he goes all the way back to their apartment. Her car isn't there, and when he goes inside, she's nowhere to be found. So he's feeling even worse at this point. But investigators can't help to be a little bit skeptical of all this, but of course they keep listening and asking him what happened next. He tells them. He begins calling up Latrese's mom, dad, other family members, and no one has seen her. No one's heard from her since the night before. She did not spend the night at her parents' house. So according to Darren, he gets a really bad feeling and he reports her missing to the police. Okay, so they still want to understand how he ends up at her car at basically the same time that the detectives are out there. He explains that as he's on the phone with police, he's also retracing his wife's path. He remembers the white car. He wants to check on that white car that he saw on the side of the road on Interstate 540. So he gets back on the highway to find it. And sure enough, when he pulls off to check, he's able to identify that it's hers within seconds. And that's when he tells detectives he got out of his car, went to the driver's side, opened the door. Perfect. His fingerprints are now on it. I mean, not that they wouldn't have been. They probably both drove the car at some point. They lived together. But just wait. And as soon as he opens the door, he looks inside. He notices there's a broken console. There's blood on the door. He also spots a picture of Latrese from Christmas that's lying on the back seat, crumbled up. Then, that's when the law enforcement officers arrived at Latrese's car, meeting up with Darren, after they had just come from the nearby homicide scene. I don't know about you, but it sounded a little too coincidental, and that's what detectives were thinking as well. Darren somehow arrives at his wife's car, his deceased wife's car, his murdered wife's car, before detectives. The car is also considered a crime scene, so he's at the scene of a crime with a story like this one. That would be pretty convenient if he were the one who did this, wouldn't it? Oh no, it wasn't me. I just got here. Like, I'm just checking up on my wife. Why didn't you do that last night? They follow the normal procedure. They asked Darren to allow them to examine his clothing as well as his body, his arms, hands, etc., to see if there's a sign that any kind of altercation had happened, and there are no marks on him. His clothes are clean. They take photos of him, and he's completely willing to allow them to take a DNA sample, but they are pressing him even harder after that. They want to put pressure on him. They want to know, what was your relationship like with your wife? And by the way, that morning, while all this is going on, Latrese's father, Sherman, is also about to find out what happened to his daughter. His morning started out differently than Darren's. The first thing that Sherman does when he wakes up is he turns on the news to see what's going on. And that day, the first thing he sees is a breaking news report. And then he sees that scene, the stretch of highway right near Wake Tech Community College. He sees the exit sign, and he sees the yellow crime scene tape with the technicians kneeling next to a blue tarp. And there's text on the screen, and it reads, "Body found on I-540. But this doesn't faze Sherman because these things happen. There was no reason he would have ever expected this to be his own daughter underneath that tarp. But sadly, it was. And Sherman gets a call from Darren asking if he knew where she was. And Sherman's thinking, she's your wife. You are her husband. You live with her. Shouldn't you be the one that knows where your wife is? Darren's like, no. And he told him about the night before. Sherman is stunned. He cannot fathom going to sleep and not even thinking about waiting up to make sure that your wife makes it home safely. He thinks it's really odd, and it makes him angry. So Sherman calls the university, and he gets transferred to a security guard who tells him, "You should probably get in touch with the sheriff's department." And Sherman is confused. He's like, "What for? Why the sheriff's office?" The first thing that usually comes to mind is that your child has gotten themselves into trouble. And remember, Sherman was a former juvenile detention officer, so it's in his instinct, and he was likely to assume Latrese had done something wrong. When he calls the sheriff says, "You need to come down to the station." So Sherman and his wife jump in the car, and they are speechless the entire drive. They didn't say one single word to each other. And they arrive there around 11 o'clock in the morning. Someone from the station greets them, and then they put them into a room. And then finally, after quite some time, an officer comes in and tells them the horrible news about their daughter. They said the body that was found on the side of I-540 and was identified this morning was your daughter, Latrese Curtis. Worse yet, her parents find out Darren had already been there to visually identify their daughter, and he didn't say one single word. They didn't hear one single word from that man. Nothing. Sherman is pissed, and rightfully so. The police wouldn't even let Latrese's parents see her body because they were not listed as her next of kin. Her husband was. So it's devastating, and Sherman thinks that Darren just nonchalantly goes to sleep, not caring about Latrese at all, and that was his biggest fear, that this man wasn't the right one, that he wasn't going to be there to protect his daughter. They didn't get to see Darren that day. And Sherman wanted to see him for sure, and I think you might know why. Because he wanted to give him more than a piece of his mind. Darren never got in touch with Latrese's family, and just wait. You'll understand more later, but it didn't matter. They wanted nothing to do with Darren because Sherman, his mind was set. That man didn't protect his daughter. That man hurt her. He's about to go off at the police station. He's like, "Let me get my hands on that man." And it makes sense that a lot of emotions would be running high. He just found out his daughter has been murdered. However, even though investigators don't have a solid alibi for Darren, considering he says he was asleep the night before, and the only person that would have been able to confirm that is dead. But they also don't have anything to hold him on. They can't arrest him, so they have to let him go. He complied with their wishes. He consented to a search of the apartment, he gave his DNA and fingerprints, and they sent him on his way. But he had to have known that he was a suspect. I mean, come on. It's obvious that the person who's closest to the victim is going to be the most likely suspect. Nevertheless, investigators have to gather more evidence, no matter what. At this point, the crime scene had become a media frenzy. Beautiful young college student found dead on the side of the highway. It made for a very good headline for newspapers and TV. But sometimes that is a necessary evil to get people's eyes on a case, to get it the attention it needs in order to be solved. The search of the apartment that Latrese shared with Darren didn't show any signs of a struggle. They also conducted a search of Darren's white Honda Civic, and there was no physical evidence that a crime had been committed or a struggle had ensued. At this point, there's nothing linking Darren to the crime scene or the murder of his wife. He said that they were happy. They were in love. They didn't have any marital issues whatsoever. Well, there's about to be a discovery during Latrese's autopsy that may change that perception. For now, Darren is left to grieve the death of his wife, and investigators move on to the next lead. While they're in the apartment complex, investigators go door to door to interview neighbors. They want to get an outside perspective on the newlyweds. One neighbor, 29-year-old Tiona Washington, she said that Latrese was quiet and she mostly kept to herself. However, they had talked on several occasions, just casual hellos, how neighbors do, like, how are you, what's new, that kind of thing. Tiona said she's a counselor at Wilson Community College, and she had never seen Darren at the apartment complex, ever. Even on her way coming and going to and from work, never saw him once. But another neighbor, Tanya Shields, she said she saw Darren almost every day. Both neighbors say that Latrese usually arrived home around 8 p.m., but Tanya was in the parking lot the night before working on her car until about 9 p.m., and Latrese never pulled in. Darren, however, did return. It was about 8:15 or 8:30 p.m., and Tanya said he was carrying a leather briefcase and a shoulder bag that was the size of a laptop. Neither one of the immediate neighbors said that they had ever heard the couple arguing, but it didn't appear that they were that happy either. Didn't seem like they were in love or anything like that, because Tanya said she never saw them smiling. This is interesting information from the people who see them on a regular basis, but to be fair, these neighbors were not friends with the couple. It's still valuable information, especially the part about Tanya seeing Darren come home that night. Still, this doesn't move the investigation forward, so they start to interview people close to Latrese, one of which is her friend Kimbyrleigha. She considered herself Latrese's best friend. She had just found out that Latrese was dead. Her mother told her, and it was shocking. Kimbyrleigha had already heard about the body that they found on the side of the highway. But it being Latrese, somebody she knew, it never crossed her mind. But when she got home from work, her mother rushes over and she says, Kimbyrleigha, that body that they found, it was Latrese. And she can't believe it. She kind of fought it. She said, no, it's not. It can't be. And her mom kept saying, yes. So Kimbyrleigha just broke down. She just kept saying, I don't think it's her because she just called me last night. That's right. Latrese made another phone call that night, and it was after the one to Darren. So what was it about? Well, Kimbyrleigha goes down to the police station to give investigators the information that she has about Latrese. Isn't it interesting that both people who were closest to Latrese get a phone call around 2 a.m.? Isn't that kind of weird? Think about it for a second. Who do you think used her phone to make those calls? Because Latrese was most likely deceased at this time. Kimbyrleigha tells them that something very eerie occurred the night before, and she thinks it may be connected to the murder. She says that she was asleep and she heard her phone ringing in the middle of the night. It could have been somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning or so, and it woke her up. She was surprised to see the number that was calling because it was Latrese, and Latrese never calls that late, so she was worried and she quickly answered it. She says, hello, Latrese? But nobody says anything. And as quiet as her room was that night, Kimbyrleigha could hear noises on the other end. She could hear wind and a distinct sound of cars rushing by a road. It sounded like she was near the highway or something, and she could hear what sounded like footsteps on gravel, but no one was saying anything. And it was odd. She was confused. She just sat there and listened for a bit, and she just got this gut feeling inside that she shouldn't hang up. At this point, she's calling out to Latrese, just repeating her name over and over again, almost yelling into the phone, Latrese, Latrese, just over and over again, and no response. So finally, she hung up. But she doesn't feel right. It scared her. It felt wrong, and she tried to call back, but this time, the call went straight to voicemail. Kimbyrleigha wanted so badly to call Darren, but she didn't know his number. Now that she knows what happened to Latrese, Kimbyrleigha wished that she would have stayed on the phone and listened. That could have been the killer's footsteps that she was hearing, and so many things were going on in her mind. She said that she was trying to piece together what the call was about. Was it before the murder? Was it during it? Was it after? When? And what were the noises? It was just haunting to think that she could have been listening at the moment her friend was killed, and there was nothing that she could do. I told you that the media was getting on this case very quickly. They knew it was going to be something big, so they go ahead and release Darren's 911 call, and the rumors start to fly. In cases like this, it is usually the husband. And there are many people that think it's very unusual that Darren would make that 911 call to report Latrese missing around the same exact time the body was found. Was this some kind of way to create an alibi? He sounds pretty calm, in my opinion, for someone who thinks his wife is actually missing. And the public thinks so too. Darren definitely felt the pressure. You go from being a nobody nobody at all, nobody knows you, nobody knows what you look like, knows your name, to everyone recognizing you, pointing fingers, bombarding you at your apartment, and not for something good. And that was what was happening to him within just a day of this crime occurring, because everyone wants answers. Surprisingly, Darren calls investigators with something that he says he dug up after being released from the police station the day before. He says as soon as he got home, he started doing some research of his own. He pulled up Latrese's phone records, specifically looking for a few things. A number of a friend who was expecting a baby, because he wanted to gather some more information from anyone that he knew his wife was talking to on a regular basis. He also wants to know who Latrese was calling the night before. And he tells investigators that he stumbled upon a phone number that Latrese had called a couple times. It was a number that he figured out she called and texted a lot. The number wasn't familiar to him, so he tells investigators that he called it, and he was surprised when a man picked up. Darren was like, "Who is this? How do you know Latrese?" And he tells the man, "She didn't come home last night." And instead of this guy explaining himself, the guy on the other end just says, "Is she okay? Let me know if she's okay." And he says this several times, according to Darren, who says he was too shocked and confused to say anything more. So clearly there was another man in Latrese's life. But who was he? Investigators aren't sure how accurate the story is. Darren could be trying to take the focus off himself, but they take down the information and get a copy of Latrese's phone records so they can analyze them. This man could be anyone. It could be a coworker, a friend. It doesn't have to be sinister. But the way he asked if Latrese was okay, it does raise a red flag, if it's true. Because why was he so concerned? So they run this unknown male's phone number. It comes back to a Stephen Randolph. That name means nothing to them at this point, but it's another lead, and that was important. This Stephen guy could provide them with more information about their victim. So they set out to track him down. Meanwhile, the autopsy report comes back. It's bad. Horrific, actually. Just the sheer brutal manner in which Latrese was injured. The report revealed that she sustained blunt force trauma to her head, specifically behind her right ear. But what was completely unbelievable and devastating was that they discovered an upward of 40 wounds. On her face, her neck, her chest, her torso had been stabbed. It was extreme. The wounds went through her carotid artery, her jugular vein, even her vocal cords were cut. One wound started on one side of her neck and went across to the other side in an attempt to completely remove her head. There was also a struggle between Latrese and the perpetrator because her fingernails were damaged. This wasn't a robbery. She still had her personal belongings, and she had a pair of expensive earrings that were still in her ears. It's estimated that she was killed between the hours of 1 and 2 a.m. Also, the fact that her car was far away from her body, that meant to detectives that someone else drove her car. So they decide to take swabs from the inside, from the steering wheel, the console, other areas, and test it for DNA evidence along with her body and anything on her fingernails and whatnot. When investigators find all of this out, though, it's really hard for them to look past Darren being the one that did this. But the fact that he's just introduced another man into the situation leads them to believe that he might be tipping his hat, that he might, like I said, be trying to force them in another direction. Did Darren find out what was going on with Latrese and another guy? They're about to get answers due to something else that the medical examiner found during the autopsy. A condom. They find a condom stuck inside of Latrese's body. So it's up inside there. It's stuck inside. And that's interesting. This is unusual. This is something they need to question Darren about. And he comes back and says, "I don't use condoms with my wife." So things are getting very complicated and confusing. If this wasn't a condom from Darren and Latrese having sex, who was it from and why was it still there? This is all happening at the same time that they find out who Stephen Randolph is. It turns out he's pretty popular. He's a good-looking, basketball player at North Carolina Central University. Stephen was actually trying to become a professional NBA basketball player. He took his college basketball career very seriously. They don't exactly know what the connection would be between Latrese and Stephen, though. However, when they go back and interview some of Latrese's friends, a few of them say they do know about Stephen and that he and Latrese were close. And in the last few months, they had grown even closer. But what does that mean exactly? Why doesn't Darren seem to know about Stephen or who he is? Was this Stephen's condom that they found during the autopsy? Investigators don't have to wonder very much longer, because just 2 days after Latrese's body was discovered, Stephen walks into the Wake County Sheriff's Office and he wants to speak to detectives, and he's not alone. He is with a local pastor named Robert Reeves. This looks interesting. You've got your pastor escorting you to the police station. There's got to be something going on here. Sometimes people don't answer to God first and confess their sins straight to the Lord. Sometimes they go to their pastor first. So investigators are very interested about what is going on here. They take Stephen into one room and they take Pastor Reeves into another. Investigators don't waste a second of their time. They immediately ask Stephen, "Who are you and what business do you have with our victim, Latrese Curtis, a married woman?" He says, "Well, I attend North Carolina Central with Latrese. I play basketball. We had a few classes together. We met back in September. We're just friends." Friends. We see each other here and there, and we're friends. Emphasis on friends 4 times. So detectives were like, okay, let me get this straight. You're just friends, for the record? You're friends with Latrese Curtis, right? Nothing more? You just see each other during classes. You don't ever see each other anywhere else. And that's when he said, "Well, we do sometimes study together at the library." Now he's lying, and they know that not because of what he said, but it's how he said it. These detectives are not stupid. They're seasoned detectives. They have dealt with men like Stephen before, and they have an inkling that that condom they found is his. That's when they take those phone records and they push them right in front of him and they say, "Stephen, we know you're not being honest with us. She talked to you the night she was killed. As a matter of fact, you might be one of the last people to talk to Latrese." There was a phone call between Stephen and Latrese after 10 p.m. That was following the phone call to her husband. And not only that, detectives show that a phone call came into his phone from Latrese around 2 o'clock in the morning. So what does he have to say about all that? Were those just friendly phone calls right before Latrese was killed? That is when he starts to come up with a different version of him and Latrese's relationship, one that is more than just friends, which is what detectives already assumed was the truth. Now he says, okay, you know what? We're more than friends. But it just started happening. We were friends. This was the first time that we were intimate. She came over my house and things progressed into sex. That's when they confront him about what they found during the autopsy, the condom. And he doesn't hesitate on that one because they're probably going to somehow find DNA or something on the condom. So there's no backing down at this point. He admits it. Yes, that was my condom. So was there a reason why Miss Curtis still had a condom inside of her? That's what they want to know. Why was it there? This is when Stephen explains. While they were having sex, somehow the condom fell off. After they were done, they noticed it was missing. They couldn't find it anywhere, so naturally they assumed it was inside Latrese. Stephen explained he tried to retrieve the condom, and Latrese tried to retrieve the condom, and neither one of them could get it out. Yes, the condom was trapped inside, and they didn't know what to do. They were both concerned. Clearly, you usually use a condom because you don't want to get pregnant or get an STD or both, or either one of those things. So it's a concern. Latrese is having an affair. She clearly wouldn't want to have a condom stuck inside for various reasons. Number one, what if her husband finds it? Number two, What if she gets pregnant with another man's child? And number 3, does this man have an STD? And now she might because the condom failed? Lots of questions are going through her mind potentially. And as for Stephen, well, he would be concerned because he's a basketball player. It's a pretty big deal in his world. He's an athlete with a lot of ambition. He's a big man on campus, a standout student at his school, and he's having a relationship with a married woman. I'm pretty sure that he did not want to get Latrese pregnant. That would probably throw off a lot of his plans. Investigators are really starting to put things together here, especially when they ask what happens next. Stephen says, well, Latrese was getting uncomfortable because she was trying to retrieve the condom and she couldn't. So she says, I've got to leave. I've got to do this in the privacy of my own bathroom or just somewhere else. She didn't feel comfortable. And she could probably have better luck if she was able to be alone to figure it out. Well, investigators are thinking this could have been why Stephen got upset, because she was adamant about leaving. His reputation could have been in a position to be compromised, especially because it turns out Stephen also has a girlfriend. He is not single. And he was expected over at her house that night. This is where he said he went after leaving his apartment. When Latrese told him that she had to go, he made his way to his girlfriend's house. They ask him, approximately what time did Latrese leave? And what time did you go over to your girlfriend's? They're trying to put together a timeline. They know Latrese talked to Darren around 10 p.m. that night. Remember? She said she was running late from class. She was at the library studying. Darren said nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She told him she was on her way home and she might stop to get a bite to eat. So that would mean she would arrive around 11:30 p.m. The thing is, we know Latrese was lying. She wasn't running late from class. She wasn't studying at the library. She was actually at Stephen's having sex with him. Stephen said she left his house somewhere around 10 p.m. and that he left shortly afterward. Then he says, you can confirm this with my friend Warren Robertson, because I called him to tell him what was happening. And Warren met him at his girlfriend's house, Velma Newton. That's her name, sometime after 10 p.m. And he was with him for the next few hours until him and Stephen went home around 1:30 in the morning. However, detectives know that there were 2 calls that were made after 1:30 in the morning from Latrese's phone, one to Kimbyrleigha and one to Stephen. So which one came first? And why were those calls made? Stephen is adamant he had nothing to do with Latrese's murder. However, investigators are not so sure of that because he is now at the top of their list of suspects. And when they're talking to his friend Warren, it doesn't really help that. Warren was called in. Detectives want to know what's going on with Stephen, what happened the night before. Warren lets them know it's true. Stephen called and he was frantic. He was talking about what happened with the condom. He was saying, I'm worried about this entire situation, and he needed someone to talk to. He told him that a few friends were going to meet up at Velma's, and he told Warren to come. As soon as Warren gets there, he says that Stephen's phone is blowing up with calls from Latrese. Stephen is trying to figure out what he should do. Finally, he answers Latrese's phone call. Warren is sitting right there. He can hear everything that's going on. He knows the content of that conversation and what it was about. It was about Latrese being scared she might be pregnant. This was a stressful conversation. And not only that, Warren says that Latrese was interested in taking the relationship to the next level. That's another thing that was discussed in this phone call, her intention to leave her husband. Well, that's a shock, because as far as Darren was concerned, he told detectives that nothing was wrong in their marriage. Maybe the neighbors were right. Maybe they didn't look happy because they weren't happy. They press Warren for more information, and he says, well, Stephen started talking to Latrese because she said that her and her husband were separated. The phone call, very stressful in nature, complicated situation, was being compounded with the fact that Latrese was worried about now going home to her husband with the condom stuck inside. He also states that Stephen was correct in saying that they both left Velma's place around 1:30. Now, detectives are looking back in Darren's direction. Maybe everything he told police was a lie. After all, he was the one they found at the crime scene. They're about to get more information that tends to complicate things even more. Because remember that they're interviewing the pastor in the other room? I mean, how could they get any luckier that they have a man of God that has come forward about to tell them information regarding one of the biggest sins against another human being, murder? Pastor Robert Reeves is a 43-year-old evangelical minister. He's actually affectionately known by the community as just the bishop. And this is a very tight-knit evangelical community. And he's well known in this community. Pastor Reeves is a very well-respected man. He's a motivational speaker. He's a mentor, very charismatic. So it's no wonder why someone like Stephen would come to him for advice, especially in the current situation that he was going through. So detectives are eager to talk to Pastor Reeves, and the pastor is eager to talk to them. Detectives ask Pastor Reeves what he can tell them about Stephen. And he explains he met Stephen at a car wash while Stephen was working there in the summer of 2007. Whenever the pastor was over there getting his car washed, they would have small talk together. And what he gathered from Stephen and those conversations was that Stephen was very serious about his basketball career. But he had fallen on some hard times. He didn't have a steady job, and he wasn't getting paid enough. He didn't have a place to live, and he was basically crashing on friends' couches. So the pastor did what he does with everyone. He ministers to them. He tells him, listen, here's my information, talk to me, come to my church. Maybe there's something that we can do to figure out your situation. And eventually, the pastor offers him his basement. He says, listen, I live with my sister, Willie Mae Thorpe. But he tells Stephen, I have a 2-bedroom house. My sister lives in the other room upstairs, but I have a basement suite, and I wouldn't mind renting it to you for like $300 a month. Can you do that until you get back on your feet? And Stephen says, yeah, that would really help him out. So he explained to the detectives that Stephen's been living there ever since, and the pastor tries to help him whenever he can. But they want to know more about Stephen himself. The pastor describes him as a ladies' man. And yes, he's aware that Stephen is bringing women back to the house. And no, he's not thrilled about it. But he's free to do what he wants. The detectives specifically want to know about the night of the 29th. And Pastor Reeves explains that he did know about a woman that Stephen brought home that night. He confirms Latrese had been there. He said he saw Latrese's white car in the driveway when he was on his way to the church service around 8 p.m. And he was at church until about 11 or 11:30. And when he came home, both Stephen and Latrese's car were no longer there. He was at home for the rest of the night, and he did not notice anything unusual. But the next morning, something happened. Stephen confided in him something about a phone call between him and Latrese sometime around midnight. Detectives want to know more, because they know there was a phone call that was made in the middle of the night. And maybe when Stephen was relaying it to the pastor, he said midnight, but it was really like 2 a.m. According to Pastor Reeves, Stephen said the phone call was in regard to Latrese wanting to take the relationship to the next level. And in Pastor Reeves' perspective, it seemed like Stephen was implying he wasn't interested in having a deeper relationship with Latrese, that it was just a sexual encounter. Besides, this is a man who already has a girlfriend, and Latrese is married. So this kind of piques the investigators' interest because they didn't hear that version from Stephen himself, and this is the second time they're hearing about a relationship being taken to another level. Warren had also said something similar. The tone in Pastor Reeves' voice is one of disappointment mixed with accusation. It really seems like the evidence is pointing to Stephen. They were curious as to whether Stephen thought that somehow Latrese was going to get in the way of his career. Because if this was an unexpected pregnancy and he's about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, or he believes that he is, because he's thinking he's going to go into the NBA, he could have done something drastic. And now he's trying to cover his tracks. Not only that, Pastor Reeves mentioned, by the way, Stephen has a knife and sword collection. So they execute a search warrant for Stephen's car and the home that he shares with the pastor. They also want to make sure to interview Willie Mae, Pastor Reeves' sister, as well as Velma Newton, who was Stephen's girlfriend. I know there were a lot of players in the story, and I'm doing my very best to keep track of each and every one the best that I can. The search of Stephen's car, as well as the room he was renting in the basement of Pastor Reeves' house, doesn't turn up any clues. There's no connections to the murder there. Nothing in the house shows any sign of a struggle or anything that even connects Steve to Latrese. However, when detectives are at Pastor Reeves' residence, they're doing a very thorough investigation, and they run the license plate of a minivan that's sitting in the driveway. This minivan belongs to Pastor Reeves. However, there's a hit on the license plate being involved in some kind of traffic incident on January 30th around 1:30 in the morning. That was just 6 hours before Latrese's body was discovered. It turns out a state trooper named Isaac Cooper, he is from the North Carolina Highway Patrol. He's driving around checking for disabled vehicles. That was part of his routine that night. He's going along Interstate 540. He sees a minivan. It's on the shoulder, on the eastbound side, and it has its hazards lights on. So he stops to make sure everything's okay. And when the officer gets to the vehicle, no one's inside, and that was odd. The hazards are on, the windshield wipers are going, the windows are kind of open a bit. The driver's side window is like halfway down, even though it's raining. So he checks the door, and it's unlocked. And the keys are still in the ignition, but no one's there. And he thought that was really weird. So he's looking around, and he notices on the opposite side of I-540, now this is westbound, there's a white car, and it has its hazards on as well. The trooper went ahead and ran the license plate of the minivan. That's why it's in the system. However, he never got a chance to go get the license plate of the other car because he got called away. Once he was given an update about the minivan not being stolen, he kind of dismissed the incident altogether. Plus, that vehicle was no longer there. However, after getting the description of the vehicle on the other side of the highway, investigators realized that was most likely Latrese's vehicle. Not to mention, the location that the trooper gave them for the white vehicle wasn't where it was ultimately found. That location was actually where the body was found. So that car had been moved to its final destination after the trooper had seen it across the highway in close proximity to a minivan belonging to the roommate of their prime suspect, Stephen Randolph. So since they have Pastor Reeves still there, they ask him, do you know or have any explanation as to why your vehicle would be located on the side of the road at 1 o'clock in the morning, the night of Latrese's murder? And he's like, wait a minute. No, I didn't put it there, but I have an explanation. The explanation is the only other person that has a key to that vehicle is Stephen, and he uses it all the time. As a matter of fact, he was driving that vehicle the past couple weeks because his car was in the shop being repaired. Now, I told you this case was going to be confusing, but detectives don't really think it is. They know that Stephen left Velma's around 1:30, according to Warren. Whose vehicle was he driving? Or whose vehicle did he possibly pick up after returning back home? When I say home, we know it's Pastor Reeves' house. Did he possibly tell Latrese that he was going to meet her somewhere, and that was what the phone call was about at 2 a.m.? It makes sense, but they've got to prove it. They call Velma in for questioning, and she confirms her boyfriend is Stephen Randolph. And he was at her house at 10 o'clock, and he left somewhere around 1:30. And he's a really good guy. There's no way he would be involved in murdering someone, according to her. They asked her if she noticed anything unusual or suspicious about him, and she says no. He was perfectly fine. He was completely normal. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Well, now they tell her about the fact that they knew he was having an affair with Latrese. Then they specifically asked her if Stephen ever drives Pastor Reeves' minivan, and she says, yeah, he's had to drive it several times. But she still insists, I'm telling you, he has nothing to do with this murder. And that's when they look at her and they say, well, do you? And that's surprising, but it kind of makes sense. These love triangles, they can make people do crazy things. Maybe Velma knew what was going on. Maybe she didn't want to lose her MBA-bound boyfriend. Maybe she was worried about a pregnancy and overheard conversations that her boyfriend was having at her apartment. The fact that he had slept with another woman that night and she would possibly be able to find that out, that could be a reason why someone would commit a crime like this. But she's like, listen, you don't understand. You don't know the reason why Stephen was driving Pastor Reeves' vehicle. It's because his tires had been slashed a couple weeks ago. And not only that, somebody was targeting him and Velma. Maybe that same person had a reason to hurt or target Latrese as well. Detectives want to understand, what in the world is this woman talking about? There's so much information coming out. They don't know where to start. But now they've got this story about slashed tires and people targeting one another. Well, she can explain. She says that they had been receiving really weird phone calls. There was a person threatening her and trying to break up her and Stephen. They would call over and over again. This person wasn't just threatening Velma, they were also calling Stephen and doing the exact same thing. Velma explained that in late October 2007, just a few months earlier, she started to get really threatening phone calls. She ends up telling Stephen about them. This man that was calling said that he was going to end Stephen's basketball career and break his legs. That Velma needed to tell her boyfriend to stop doing whatever he was doing. Velma couldn't figure out who was making these phone calls because the person had blocked their number. But it turned out Stephen was also getting these calls. One time the caller said they hoped that Stephen had a gun. And detectives ask her, well, does Stephen have a gun? And she says, yeah, he does. That he had gotten it in the past year, she thought. She explained that the slashed tires happened pretty recently. It was on December 11th. Stephen had plans to come over to her house, but when he went to leave, he realized that his car had a flat tire. So he goes to the gas station, gets the tire fixed, ultimately making it to her place. While he's there, he starts getting these threatening phone calls again from a private number. When he goes to leave Velma's later that night, he walks out and all 4 of his tires had been slashed. Velma also remembers that when Stephen called Pastor Reeves to ask him for help, he told Stephen that someone had been ringing the doorbell at the house and running away. So they're freaked out. When Pastor Reeves offers to come get him from Velma, Stephen doesn't even want to go back home because he is scared. He just had his tire slash. He hears someone is ringing the front doorbell where he lives, so he decides he's just going to stay where he is and spend the night with Velma. The next morning, Stephen and Pastor Reeves get his car towed. Meanwhile, the pastor lets him borrow the minivan so that he could get to school, and until he could get enough money to actually repair his tires because it's expensive. He couldn't get them fixed right away. Velma said that both of them were really freaked out. Not to mention, Christmas break, Stephen goes home to visit his family in Baltimore, and when he's gone, Velma gets a phone call again. This time, the caller tells Velma, I just slashed your tires. I'm really sorry. She recorded this phone call, and she wasn't even home at the time where her car was. So she called someone that was, and she asked them to go outside and check on her car, and it turns out all 4 of her tires were also slashed. Detectives don't know what to make of all this, but it sounds very ominous. It sounds scary. It doesn't sound right. So they want to see the phone records, and they pull them up, and Velma's right. There were calls coming in from a blocked number on the days that she talked about on both her phone and Stephen's phone. So who's making these calls? Well, they suspect it's most likely Darren, their first suspect. It's probably some kind of revenge because this is the man that is talking to his wife. This case was hard for investigators because the people they interviewed who are at the top of their list really don't have airtight alibis. Darren says he's at home sleeping with no one to confirm that. Velma says that she's at home. She sees her boyfriend Stephen leave about 1:30. His friend also leaves at 1:30, and they all go to their homes with no one to confirm that they're really there. Nobody has anyone to 100% confirm they weren't out committing this crime. So maybe there's someone who can clear it up. Pastor Reeves' sister, Willie Mae. So they call her in for an interview. Investigators ask what she knows in regard to Stephen, as well as Latrese. Her version is that Stephen moved in sometime in the summer of 2007, and that she had actually seen Latrese over her house before January 29th, but she's also aware that she was there that night, because when she came home from church around 8:45 or 9, she saw Stephen with Latrese. She also confirms that Pastor Reeves was not present at that time. She went upstairs to watch TV, and she could hear Stephen and Latrese leave the house around 9:30 or 10. They asked her when the next time she saw Stephen was, and she said when she woke up around 7:15 in the morning. She could hear Stephen in the downstairs bathroom, but she doesn't know what he did after 10 p.m., and that she went to bed around midnight or 12:30 in the morning. Nothing woke her up during the night. Again, they can't confirm the alibis. She said she did see her brother, Pastor Reeves, sleeping in his bed that morning. Then they ask, "Do you know what time he came back from church?" And she said that she didn't think anyone came home after she had gone to sleep. That includes Pastor Reeves. So now even his alibi doesn't seem to check out. So is everyone just covering for one another? Well, each one of these people that were interviewed were willing to give their DNA, and they were about to get the results back to see if any of them were a match for the evidence pulled from Latrese's car. Meanwhile, they go back to talk to Steve because they have a lot more information at this point, and they think that they're going to get a confession. But instead, as soon as they start to accuse Stephen of committing this crime and putting this evidence in front of him about him borrowing the vehicle, the DNA results come back in, and it turns the entire case upside down. Up until this point, they have 3 potential suspects. Darren Curtis, the husband who's without an alibi, whose wife is having an affair. Then there's the man she's having an affair with, Stephen Randolph, the young, good-looking basketball player with a very promising future in the NBA, who was worried that he may have gotten Latrese pregnant. And lastly, you've got Pastor Robert Reeves, a man whose car was found near the scene of the crime, but seemingly has no motive to want to hurt this woman. But after the DNA comes back on February 2nd, they quickly make an arrest. But it stuns everyone, especially the public. Pastor Robert Reeves is arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Latrese Curtis. What? Okay, you have to hear what happens next. Of course, the pastor is claiming 100% innocence. His sister's shocked. She's like, wait a minute. My brother is a man who's partially paralyzed in his left arm. She tells detectives that her brother had been mugged many years ago back in New York. He was stabbed in his left arm, and afterward he was never able to fully use it again. He doesn't have good grip in that hand. He can't pick up anything heavy, and the use of that arm was very minimal. Well, speaking of that arm, when they interviewed Reeves the day prior, they noticed that he had abrasions on his right arm, the good arm, and his knee, and they were fresh wounds. When they questioned him, he said he sustained those injuries when he was helping Stephen move a desk at the house. Well, both Willie Mae and Stephen confirmed, yeah, they moved a desk, but both of them said they did not ever see Reeves get hurt. It was those injuries, coupled with the DNA report, that led to his arrest. The car contained a DNA mixture of blood from 2 individuals. However, both Darren and Stephen were ruled out as contributors, but Pastor Reeves, he couldn't be ruled out. The report stated verbatim that the probability that someone other than Pastor Robert Reeves in the North Carolina African American population contributed to the DNA discovered on Latrese's steering wheel was 1 in 147,000 people, so a very slim chance that it was anyone else except for Pastor Reeves. He also has a criminal record that was sexual in nature, but it didn't include any violent crimes. And the community seemed to agree that Pastor Reeves was not guilty. Even Latrese's parents were perplexed. Sherman's mind was made up. He thought Darren was the perpetrator, and this arrest divided a lot of people in the community. The congregation is angry. They think police have the wrong guy. But that's because the police are very tight-lipped about what other evidence may have linked Pastor Reeves to Latrese. And the public had to wait almost a year until the trial to find out what it was, but you don't have to wait that long, because I'm obviously going to tell you exactly what investigators were trying to keep close to their vests. No one was allowed to talk about it, especially Stephen, who used to be their prime suspect, but now he was about to be one of their prime witnesses, testifying against his former roommate at the end of September 2009 at his trial. What no one knew was that when detectives went in to confront Stephen about the evidence they found regarding him using the pastor's car, he pretty much goes off on them. He's like, listen, you do not understand. You're looking at the wrong person. I never drove Pastor Reeves' vehicle that night. He admits, yes, I've had to borrow it because my tires were slashed, but that was back on December 11th. It was weeks ago. He says even though it was expensive, he did get them fixed at least a few days before Latrese was found murdered. There was no reason for him to be borrowing Pastor Reeves' car. Then he says, if that car was on the scene, it's because Pastor Reeves drove it there. He says, and he's not who you think he is. Really? Well, then who is he? He said, look, the guy is weird. They're like, how so? What he says is a huge turning point in this case. He explains that Pastor Reeves is nosy. Like, he's always trying to get up in his business, especially when it comes to women. And I mean, for the most part, that's not that unusual. A pastor is usually concerned about the well-being of a man he's trying to help, especially considering that premarital sex is seen as a sin in that community. But Stephen goes one step further. He says, no, he's not just nosy because I'm dating women or having sex with them or even cheating or anything like that. He's made him feel really uncomfortable in the past. He said after he moved in with Pastor Reeves, Velma had come over a few times and they had sex together. Pastor Reeves tries to, sit down with him, have a conversation like guy talk about sex and all that. Okay, fine. He's a pastor. But then he says something weird. According to Stephen, Pastor Reeves goes, I know you're always looking for money and you're kind of down on your luck and, you're here because you want to save rent. Have you ever considered being a male escort? You're really good looking and it pays well. Okay, so Stephen admits, I was in need of some quick cash. I was kind of thinking it over. I was like, I don't know, maybe. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility for him. It wasn't out of the question, but he really wasn't sure why the pastor would be bringing this up. And the conversation just evolved from there into a very weird topic where the pastor is basically confiding in him about this fraternity party that he once went to. He said to Steve, I was young once and I was out drinking, having a good time. He went to this fraternity party and he ends up having somebody go down on him. Okay, TMI. Good for you, man. However, the story gets a little weird. It goes to a different place. When the lights turned on, Pastor Reeves realized something. What? What did he realize? It was an escort or what? Because what does this have to do with all that? Because the conversation is going back and forth. They're having this, quote unquote guy talk. And in the middle of all this and him telling the story about the lights turning back on, he just turns over to Stephen and says, how big is your junk? Yeah, I know. And Stephen's sitting there thinking, is this pastor serious? Is this about starting this escort business? Well, he thinks so. So he drops his pants. And that's when the pastor continues the story and says, when the lights came back on at the fraternity party, I realized I was with a man. Okay. The pastor was kind of acting like this wasn't really that big of a deal. Because he says to Stephen, you know what's crazy? It didn't feel any different than when a woman did it. That's when the pastor grabbed Stephen, where. Yeah, He's doing that and saying, I really think you could be a male escort. Yeah, he did that. All the while saying things about, oh, you could be a male escort, but sometimes they have to perform with other men. But it's really good money. That's when Stephen started to realize that the pastor was coming on to him. At this point, Stephen was like, okay, this man clearly wants something from me. Either he wants me to do something to him or he wants to do something to me that I'm not comfortable with. So Stephen up and leaves the house because he's that uncomfortable. But he does not consider this resolved. So he goes back 10 minutes later and he makes it very clear to the pastor that he is not interested in any of that in any way. At that point, Pastor Reeves apologizes. He's like, I am so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. This will never happen again. Coming from a pastor, who knows why he said what he said, right? Was he part of some weird kind of like male escort ring? What is going on? But there is one thing that's clear. Stephen wanted nothing to do with it. However, that wasn't the end of the conversation or the topic because it was brought up more than once after that. Coincidentally, it was times when Stephen had his girlfriend Velma over. It was a way for the pastor to segue into this conversation time and time again. One time saying things like, just because you let a guy do it doesn't mean that you're gay. Another time he said, listen, if you let me do it to you, I'll lower your rent. Or you know what? If you let me do it, I won't even charge you rent. At this point, Stephen had enough. It was actually making him feel more than just uncomfortable. It was to the point where he reached out to his cousin and asked to borrow a 9mm from him. Because he figured the next time this happens, the pastor might go one step further from just touching him. This guy's not getting the message. He thought he was going to have to use that 9mm the night that Latrese came over, because that was the first time that him and Latrese ever had sex. Apparently, the pastor found out about it. He was there waiting to talk to Stephen about this sexual escapade with a married woman. He pulls Stephen aside into the room, and while they're having this conversation, he brings up the inappropriate topic again. This is right after Latrese had left. And he's questioning him about whether he had just had sex with her. And he's like, yes, I did. And there was sort of this implication that he shouldn't be doing it with Latrese. He should be doing it with the pastor. Stephen had just had enough. This whole thing was making him really upset. He basically said, stop asking me this. Leave me alone. I want nothing to do with you like that. Stephen also tells investigators, guess what? Remember those threatening calls and the tire slashing? Well, they started right after the first time I told him no. Then he adds, you know what? If you don't believe what time I came home, why don't you go check the alarm system? The detectives are like, what do you mean by this? He says, well, we all have codes. Each one of us has a different code to get into the residence. I don't know the master code. Only Pastor Reeves knows that code. I've been given my own code, and so has Willie Mae. So go see what time the pastor came home, because I sure as hell know his car wasn't in the driveway when I pulled in. Investigators pull the phone records. They get forensic evidence from the alarm system at the pastor's residence, and it turns out the alarm was armed using Stephen's code around 1:30 a.m. But then at 2:30 a.m., the alarm goes off. It's triggered by someone trying to get back into the house, and it's disarmed within 4 seconds using the master code. But what really solidified the detective's theory that Pastor Reeves was the one who killed Latrese was his phone records. They pulled all 3 of them. That's right. The pastor had 3 phones: a house phone, a cell phone, and a fun phone. That's how this man referred to that 3rd phone. This was a phone that was discovered to be being paid for by the church in the church's name, but was clearly being used for things outside of church purposes. For fun. That's what the pastor said once it was discovered. One of the things he must have considered fun was harassing Stephen and Velma, because reports revealed that on December 1st, 2007, 6 calls were placed from the fun phone to Velma's number. All of these calls were intentionally blocked so that the number wouldn't be revealed. That same day, a call was made from the fun phone to Stephen's phone. And on December 11th, the day that Stephen's tires were slashed, 7 blocked calls were made from the fun phone. And 2 calls were also made from the fun phone to Velma's on the day her tires were slashed. So that means Pastor Reeves called both Stephen and Kimbyrleigha. It most likely wasn't Latrese. Was he trying to set up some kind of alibi? Was he trying to skew the timeline? We know that he loves to make phone calls. It's just something to think about. Why do you think nothing was said during that time? I don't think that Latrese's phone automatically dialed both of those people, and then it was off after that because it went straight to voicemail. So he conveniently called those 2 numbers. It's just sick. After all of this evidence came in, they developed a theory, and this was the prosecution's argument at trial about exactly what they thought happened to Latrese and why. In her opening statement, the prosecutor paints a really frightening picture of Pastor Reeves, the opposite of what he's known for. A man that was becoming more and more obsessed with Stephen Randolph. And it was that obsession, they believe, led to Latrese's murder on the night of January 29th. They believe that after Stephen and Latrese left, Pastor Reeves was overcome with jealousy, continuing to see these women coming in and out of Stephen's room, knowing that it wasn't Stephen that was allowing him to have a piece of him like these women were. So when Latrese left, Robert Reeves, in his jealous rage, followed her along that dark interstate, and somehow he convinced her to pull over. Maybe it's because he's a pastor. Maybe they knew each other. Maybe she thought something was wrong with her car. Who knows? But when she pulled over, that's when they believe he took out all of his rage and all of his jealousy on Latrese. Not once, not twice, not a dozen times, but an upward of 40 times. Because the prosecution believes that somehow, some way, he thought if he got rid of these women, then Stephen would want to be with him. Then Stephen would let him do what he wanted to do to him. It's clear that this man used his authority in the church to do evil things. He used his authority and his position to get people to trust him, only to carry out inappropriate actions. 4 other witnesses also claimed that they had seen cars similar to those owned by Reeves and Latrese together on the highway that night, near the scene of the crime. And remember that the trooper reported seeing Pastor Reeves' vehicle at 1:53 a.m. At the trial, an investigator came forward and said that he timed the drive from the location where Latrese's body was found to Reeves' home, leaving at 1:53 a.m. and arriving back at Pastor Reeves' house at 2:23 a.m. This evidence is consistent with the state's theory that Pastor Reeves had time to return home between 1:53 and 2:30 when he used the master code to disarm the alarm at his home. Of course, the defense had their own arguments. They said, oh, no. Stephen had much more to gain from getting Latrese out of the picture. There were even pastors coming forward and supporting Pastor Reeves, people from the community saying how amazing he was, how Stephen could have driven Reeves' minivan and used the master code and then lied about not knowing it. However, there were a few things that the defense couldn't argue about. 2 were direct testimony from 2 other men who had similar situations in regard to the pastor's inappropriate comments and behaviors, and another was a piece of evidence that they found at the pastor's home. Police found a receipt for a purchase of a broiling pan on the morning of January 30th. Then they find a partially melted trash can that contained accelerant and fabric, which they believe was burned clothing. They think that the pastor woke up that morning after everyone left, and he needed to get rid of his bloody clothes so that he wouldn't be implicated. So he used that pan to do it. And in the process, as he's throwing the contents away, the trash can was melted. Why else would you have a reason to burn your clothing? But it was the 2 men that came forward that really sealed the deal. LaQuinton Ford and John Ross. LaQuinton testified that while he was working at a kiosk in the mall in 2005, Pastor Reeves began talking to him and offered to give him a ride home. Because he lived far, it was like 15 to 20 miles away, he took him up on the offer, and he says that when the pastor was driving him home, he started to have guy talk with him. I don't know why they call it that. But this included talk about sex with women. Wasn't too out of the ordinary for two guys. However, when Pastor Reeves dropped him off at his house, he just asked LaQuinton, "No, how much do you pay for rent?" He says, $100 a month. He goes, "Well, you could come stay with me for free." And initially, LaQuinton says no, but then later he starts having issues with his living arrangements, and he decides to take him up on the offer, and he moves in with the pastor. He's a pastor. You're not expecting him to be sinister. But while they're living together, Pastor Reeves goes out of town. LaQuinton is there by himself. He's house sitting. He's taking care of the pastor's dog. Well, he invites his girlfriend over, and they have sex. He places a used condom in a grocery bag that he uses as a trash can, and he puts it on the doorknob outside his bedroom door. Well, a little while after Pastor Reeves had gotten home from his trip, the bag is gone, seemingly thrown away. But then he confronts LaQuinton, and he asks him, "Has anyone been over my house?" And he says, "No." And the pastor's like, "Really? So why was there a used condom in the trash can?" Kind of weird. And after this, he goes on to tell LaQuinton how mad he is that he had someone over having sex when he wasn't there. But then, just a couple nights after that, Pastor Reeves has the same conversation with LaQuinton that he had with Steve about starting an escort service. And he tells him the exact same thing. You can't tell the difference between a man or a woman. LaQuinton got so upset, he walked away and he called his mom and told her everything that was going on. Well, Pastor Reeves wasn't too happy about this rejection because he tells LaQuinton, now you have to pay rent. This put him in a really bad situation because LaQuinton had nowhere else to go. And when he showed up at work the next day, he was arrested. The pastor told police that he had damaged his property and he filed charges against him. Luckily, they were later dismissed. But do you see a similar pattern here? Well, if not, listen to what John Ross had to say at trial. Don't worry, we are wrapping up. John Ross had a similar story. He said he was working as an installation technician for the home alarm system service. He comes by Pastor Reeves' house in October of 2007 because he was having the alarm system installed. Well, John arrives around 8 o'clock in the morning. Guess who's there? Stephen. And while Stephen's there, the pastor is wearing a suit. 15 minutes after Stephen leaves, pastor changes into a sleeveless undershirt and a pair of shorts. Then he comes into the room and he starts talking to John about sex, which then leads the pastor to ask John if he's ever considered being a what? It's like a broken record, a male escort, because he's got some really good features. The pastor doesn't even hesitate after that. He just straight up asks him, how big is your junk? And then he says, have you ever let a man go down on you? And John is just so uncomfortable that he leaves. He tries to leave, but he can't because Pastor Reeves grabs him by the wrist and pulls him into the house towards the bathroom. And what he says next, John says, the Pastor Reeves said, just close your eyes and you won't know. Just let me do what I got to do and I'll give you some money for it and you can go. Wow. Well, he was able to pull away out of his grip and he left. He left everything there too. The wiring, the paperwork, everything was inside and he just ran. So it turns out that even though the pastor is supposedly half paralyzed in his left arm, it looks like he's able to use his right arm perfectly fine. And he's actually willing to become physical with someone when he doesn't get his way. But not only that, there are criminal charges to prove it. Even though those weren't allowed to be submitted as evidence in the trial, Pastor Reeves has engaged in illegal activities that include inappropriate and unwanted sexual conduct. As a matter of fact, he left a church that he used to work at, Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in South Carolina, because he was accused of that type of conduct with a boy that wasn't even an adult yet. And he was charged with conduct of the same nature on September 3rd, 1987 in South Carolina. Later, He was convicted of a third-degree charge of that nature in 1988. And when I say third-degree charge, I know you might not know what that means, but you'll hear it over and over again, especially in cases that revolve this type of action. It means that it involves someone that's not an adult and an act that they don't want done. Reeves was also charged with battery in 1982 in South Carolina. And these accusations of the same type of content were also said to have surfaced in New York while he was working there after it happened in South Carolina. So he just moved to another church, and the sick cycle began again. Just a few years before Latrese's murder, Pastor Reeves was charged again with sexual misconduct on July 13, 2002. So how does a man like this continue to work in churches? Well, they start churches of their own. That way, no one has to do a check on them, and that's exactly what Pastor Reeves was doing in this current community in North Carolina. He was charismatic. He was seen as a visionary, a loyal man of faith, and a gifted preacher, but now he's seen for his true colors. He's a killer. He's a killer who used his authority and his position in his church to get what he wanted, and when he didn't, he took something. A beautiful, innocent woman out of this world, and for that, he will spend the rest of his life in prison because the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These kind of cases make me so upset. The fact that someone can use authority, especially under the guise of a person that's supposed to be there for you, to mentor you and help you and guide you, but all they're doing is guiding you into darkness and even ending someone's life on account of not getting what they want. That's why I wanted to do this case, because I think it's so important to bring that to light. Not a lot of people like discussing these things. It's hard to do it here on YouTube. Let me know your thoughts. There are still people who question whether Pastor Reeves did this or not. But after everything I heard, there's no doubt in my mind that he did. I want to thank you so very much for giving Latrese your time and watching my video. It means a lot to me. I will see you in my next one. Bye.